Hi, everybody. I'm Bryant Jones, Executive Director of Geothermal Rising. Thank you so much for being here today. We're going to just wait a few moments as people start being let into the webinar. So give us a few moments and thank you for your patience as we just let those folks come on in. But Michael and Charles and Vanessa, thank you very much for being here today with us. We really appreciate it. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started. I'm just going to introduce Vanessa Chan, Dr. Vanessa Chan, who is the Chief Commercialization Officer and Director of the Office of Technology Transitions at the Department of Energy. Dr. Chan is responsible for driving private sector uptake of clean energy technologies, which is very relevant and pertinent to the geothermal industry. And she works with all 17 national labs and across the department to help research and demonstration of these new clean energy technologies so that they can scale and be commercialized and become a functioning part of the clean energy economy. So Dr. Chan herself is an innovator. She's worked across a wide range of ecosystems. She's had experience in academia, working for Fortune 1000 companies and startups. So she has experience and the lived experience of all different types of the ecosystem and the economy. So she has over 2 decades of experience helping organizations grow and really commercialize their businesses through a whole diverse set of industries. She's currently on a leave of absence from her role at the University of Pennsylvania's School of Engineering and Applied Science. And she also has a background and is a former McKinsey and Company partner with experience on the venture board of directors for Vanguard and the United Technology Corporation. Dr. Chan has her PhD in materials science and engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and her BSc in materials science and engineering from the University of Pennsylvania. So it's here representing the geothermal industry. Dr. Chan, I'm thrilled to have you introduce Michael and Charles and to talk about the Liftoff report that the Department of Energy just released recently on the commercialization of geothermal power and electricity in the United States. So welcome, and I'll hand it over to you, and you can introduce your colleagues.
Perfect. So I'll do that and when I hand it off to them. So good morning, everyone. I'm thrilled to join you today for the Geothermal Rising's deep dive into the Pathways to Commercial Liftoff report for next generation geothermal power. I wanted to extend my heartfelt thanks to the board for your invitation to present today, and also the continued collaboration you've had with the Department of Energy. So it's amazing to have this group of brilliant minds all focused on unlocking the vast potential of geothermal energy. And together we're brewing innovative solutions that will shape our national and global energy future. And I can feel the energy in this virtual room, which we need to harness. Our collective effort here today is crucial as we explore the transformative power of next generation geothermal technologies. And we don't have favorites, but I will secretly let you know that geothermal is actually the Secretary's favorite technology. And so really excited to be here to talk about it. So let's first set the stage with a look at our broader goals. The Biden-Harris administration is committed to a carbon emission-free energy sector by 2035 and a net zero economy by 2050. Now, achieving these audacious goals requires significant innovation and investment, challenges that we're prepared to meet with initiatives like the DOE Pathways to Commercial Liftoff. This initiative is a roadmap that is guiding all of us through the necessary transitions in energy production with a strong emphasis on public-private partnerships, because we need the private sector to really be leading in the commercialization of technologies. So today we're focused on geothermal energy, a sector where innovation meets opportunity. Our latest liftoff report on next-gen geothermal power outlines a clear and achievable path to scaling up the technology. So by 2030, we aim to achieve geothermal liftoff, producing 2 to 5 gigawatts of power across several states with an investment of $20 to $25 billion. Looking ahead to 2050, recent analysis indicates that decarbonizing the power sector will require an additional 700 to 900 gigawatts of what we call clean, firm power. So electricity with no carbon emissions that is always on. Geothermal energy with its inherent stability and capacity for significant expansion can be a major contributor to this need. Post liftoff, our goals are really ambitious, which is targeting expansion to 90 to 130 gigawatts of geothermal capacity, positioning it as a cornerstone of our clean energy future. We believe that the people in this virtual room are the people who will make this happen, and we're excited that in this webinar, we're going to dive into the techno-economics that you yourself provided us that make us confident that this can happen. The next generation geothermal technologies at the forefront, particularly enhanced geothermal systems and closed-loop systems, are absolute game changers. They leverage the Earth's heat more efficiently and can be deployed across a broad geographical range than traditional geothermal resources. But what excites me more isn't just the technology, it's the collaborative spirit that this project embodies. The DOE is committed to supporting this journey through strategic investments and partnerships that foster innovation. We believe in the power of collaboration between government, industry, investors, and researchers to drive the clean energy transition. As we prepare to drill deeper, pun intended, into the specifics of the geothermal report, remember that this is a collaborative and a living document. We value your insights and feedback, which you can provide through liftoff.energy.gov. This platform is not just a repository of information, it's a space for dialogue and development. And now I'm excited to introduce Dr. Charles Gertler from DOE's Loan Programs Office and Dr. Michael O'Connor from DOE's Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations. Doctor makes me want to break into an 80s song there. They are the co-lead authors of the Next Gen Geothermal Power Liftoff Report and will walk us through the detailed findings and strategic recommendations. They live and breathe geothermal and even dream about it. So their expertise and leadership have been instrumental in bringing this transformative work to fruition. And so let's give our full attention to Charles and Michael to provide us with a detailed walkthrough of the report, setting the stage for a robust discussion of how we can collectively drive next-gen geothermal forward. So with that, over to Doctor.
Thank you, Vanessa.
Am I unmuted? Yeah, thank you so much. My name's Mike O'Connor. That was Charles, my colleague there. I really appreciate the introduction, Vanessa. I'm one of the strategists at the Department of Energy's Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, and along with Charles, one of the lead authors of the Next Generation Geothermal Liftoff Report, who Charles will introduce himself in a moment. Over the past few months, we've had the privilege of working on this report with a number of colleagues across the Department of Energy and with industry, and we're excited to share our findings with you today, and for those of us that are watching this recording later on. As a reminder, you can download this full report, as well as all the Liftoff reports, and rewatch Department of Energy webinars on the Liftoff reports at liftoff.energy.gov. Before we dive in, I just want to emphasize that these reports are living documents. We're already working on the update to these findings, and we welcome your additional feedback. You can find a link to contact us for that input at liftoff.energy.gov/input. And with that, I'm going to kick it off to my co-conspirator, Charles.
Thank you, Mike, and apologies, I'm going to stay off camera, I think, until my internet stabilizes itself a little bit. But Charles Gertler, I am a senior consultant with the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office, one of the two lead authors with Mike on this report. Thanks again to Vanessa for introducing us and for the geothermal puns. We have a pun jar that we put a quarter into every time someone makes one, and so it's now at about $1 million. So we appreciate it. And
that is actually going to fund the next geothermal demonstration.
That's right. So I want to first take us through the report's high-level findings. And again, you can all find this online, but just to do a quick summary to set the stage. And then Mike and I are going to take you through the detail behind each of these points and highlight where even more detail can be found in the report. And I think today we want to really focus on the techno-economics and some of the economic modeling that went into the report's key findings. So I think the top line messages here, first of all, the very strong message coming out of this report is that next generation geothermal power is poised to be a key contributor to a secure domestic and decarbonized power generation or power grid in the US going forward. So because of the emerging and new technologies that are becoming better and better every day, there is a vastly expanded total resource that's available for geothermal power generation, which is really important. The industry itself, as we all know, has some really significant and unique starting advantages. We have transferable technology, supply chains, and workforces from the oil and gas sector, which is already very robust. This is one of the reasons why the total amount of investment necessary to get this technology to lift off is much lower than some other clean technologies that we're very excited about at DOE. Another key finding of this report is that the industry is on track to hitting the Earth shot, the enhanced geothermal shot that was set up by the Department of Energy a few years ago, which is a national average LCOE of $45 a megawatt hour by 2035. And we do power sector modeling for this report built off of the Earth shot analysis that demonstrates the next generation geothermal industry could reach 90 gigawatts and potentially much more by 2050. To do all this and to stay on track to this full deployment means hitting liftoff around 2030. And liftoff is a term DOE uses to describe where a technology and industry becomes self-sustaining. We have some criteria for hitting liftoff, and we'll discuss those in detail later. But in short, it'll take about $20 to $25 billion of investment. And there are 5 key challenges to achieving scale, a liftoff and scale that we'll go through at the end of this webinar. So with that, let me hand it back to Mike to discuss chapter 1.
Thank you, Charles. And I am still learning where unmute is on Zoom. So in chapter 1, we had sort of, again, it's the overview and the value proposition for the technology writ large. Next generation geothermal technologies, I think the reason that there's a lot of folks in our building that are very excited about it and writ large is that they create their own resource from this ubiquitous hot rock resource that we have, reservoir that we have below our feet. This expands the availability of geothermal resources from 40 gigawatts to over 5,000. We don't actually know the end number of that, but it's real big. Next generation geothermal can economically provide 90 gigawatts of the 700 to 900 that we need for clean, firm power for a decarbonized 2050. Other technical and market factors can up that number substantially up to 300 gigawatts. We'll talk about what gets you there. Rapidly increasing projections of electricity demand are driving increased need for clean, firm power. So data centers and large industrial facilities and things like that, driving PPAs today to be signed between $70 to $100 a megawatt hour for clean, firm power, which is substantially above the average solar PPA in North America today. The economic deployment of next generation geothermal doubles if we also can capture the value proposition of subsurface energy storage using geothermal reservoirs to hold heat while demand is low, and then release it when demand is high. Finally, the next generation geo industry can leverage a large and existing workforce and supply chains, and that's one of those key starting advantages that my colleague Charles talked about earlier, enabling more rapid uptake. I think this will be the fastest slide of all of them here because this is a community that should have pretty substantial familiarity with the types of divisions that we're talking about around technologies. But in general, next generation represents these approaches, these myriad of approaches that are able to engineer their own resource from the ubiquitous hot rock you can see on the right-hand side of these 3 panels, EGS, which uses hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling to stimulate reservoirs, and then closed loop systems, which are exactly that, systems that run a loop through the hot rock and conduct heat through that loop. Both of these opportunities require massive unlocks in drilling and exploration, which we're going to describe as we see as viable throughout this report. This contrasts with our hydrothermal approach today. You see on the left-hand side where there is a resource that very crudely drawn there is sort of anomalous in a location, and it's up to the developer to figure out where that resource is. And if that resource is not in that location, there's not as much recourse for what the developer can do. And so, yes, this expands the value proposition enormously, right? We see on the left-hand side of this figure that this is the map of the US and what we anticipate to be the next generation geothermal potential. And where the conventional resources we have today, the 93 power plants online, are with dots. You can see, obviously, there's deep red in the Western US and the Mountain West, where you get over 500 gigawatts in some of these states of really all the energy you need effectively. But that's not really the story that motivates me here. The story that motivates me is that most of the US has gigawatts measurable of geothermal power to be drawn upon, in particular on the East Coast in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. You're seeing substantial increase in resource, and again that expands what we see from 40 gigawatts to over 5,500 measurable today, and that's, I think, only going to 7 kilometers depth or 8 kilometers depth. Don't quote me on that. The value proposition for geothermal is substantial, right? It has it's clean, it is firm, it is flexible, it requires a small land footprint and no additional energy input, and it is exposed to minimal supply chain risk. Next generation geothermal can also scale relatively robustly and quickly, supported by the availability of workforce with translatable skill sets. That's not necessarily something we see in some of these other technologies. I think I want to focus on a couple of these value propositions as we go through this webinar, in particular, the clean, firm aspect of it, right? Next generation geothermal fills a critical need of clean, firm power. The department-sponsored modeling states that the U.S. will need to add between 700 to 900 gigawatts. That's what you see on the top panel of this figure right here. The NREL Net 100% by 2035 study funded by DOE. DOE-sponsored modeling, again, 700 to 900 gigawatts of clean, firm power by 2050 to achieve our decarbonization goals. And that number quite likely is an underestimate. Then the bottom panel shows what our thinking there. The nationwide forecast of electricity demand growth, so the growth we anticipate in electricity demand by 2028, increased from a projection of 3.8% in 2022 to 7.8% in 2023. That is a rapid doubling in 1 year. This increase requires utilities to plan for 17 additional gigawatts of capacity before what was planned for only a year ago. Doing this cleanly is very expensive. Buyers pay $70 to $100 per megawatt for clean, firm power routinely, and geothermal has already emerged as a valuable supplier in this market. This is we've seen this happen most notably in California, where a flurry of new hydrothermal PPAs at high price points has been driven by a public policy that we'll be talking about later. The clean, firm power market has two major buyers. One is vertically integrated electric utilities that have to satisfy mandates for clean energy, while also maintaining grid functionality at least cost. And then the second is public and private purchasers of clean energy demand driven by decarbonization goals. That's sort of the market that's driving these large increases we're seeing here. We mentioned the workforce, and yes, I think that is a strength that geothermal can and should tout wherever it can, right? The workforce of over 300,000 exists today that already possesses the skill set and the expertise necessary for geothermal power development. These workers are largely in both the oil and gas and electric power industries, and you can see those represented on this figure on the left-hand side being the oil and gas folks from the subsurface, really, where the transferable skills occur, and then on the right-hand side, the power plant folks, where the transferable skills occur. The total number of jobs needed for a mature geothermal industry, denoted in the light green bars, is less than the size of the existing workforce we have right now with adjacent critical skills, denoted by the gray bars with the dotted lines. Furthermore, substantial shares of these jobs are permanent. Geothermal creates 3 to 4 times the number of long-term jobs per megawatt as solar and wind, and those jobs are local. These factors make geothermal a key component to what we consider a just transition. So the market potential, right, given these value propositions is appealing. Next generation geothermal energy can provide somewhere between 90 to 132 gigawatts of electric power to a fully decarbonized grid by 2030, with the potential for significantly more if you have those market factors we described earlier. Reaching the energy Earthshot target results in 90 to 100 gigawatts of next generation geothermal on the grid by 2050. That's denoted in the light green line, and that's a 25-time increase from today. Significant deployment can occur in the next decade as well. The bars in the bottom show how much capacity is added in each 2-year increment. By 2035, 30 to 35 gigawatts can be online, and you're adding multiple gigawatts per year. If land for other renewables becomes restricted, that's represented by the dark green line, you get more geothermal. Over 130 gigawatts of next generation geothermal may be economically deployed in these scenarios. Scenarios with limited deployment of hydrogen and DAC can triple geothermal potential to nearly 300 gigawatts. So these all play in the sort of clean, firm power space, and projections of cost for all of these technologies are relatively uncertain out to 2050. The map on the right shows where we see this technology deploying in an economic fashion, right? So the bulk of next generation deployment will still occur in the Western US. Multiple gigawatts do come online in the East. In particular, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Virginia, as well as New York, deploy geothermal as early as 2040. So that is 16 years from now. And then in 2050, we see deployment in some of the Southwest as well as the Mountain West. The other states where we're seeing it that you wouldn't think of it: Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, gigawatts online. Finally, long duration energy storage, as we talked about, is a potential value addition to this technology, and that value addition can drive your capacity online to increase. As stated earlier, geothermal plants can be run flexibly. That's a value proposition, and they can provide additional value that drives a doubling of geothermal deployment if that flexibility is deployed. Geothermal plants can store power during low pricing events and then discharge it when prices rise. The impact of that type of operation is represented by the sum of these two lighter green bars here on the bottom, where you see over 160 gigawatts of geothermal deployed by 2050 with flexibility. I'm going to kick it over to Charles to take you through chapter 2, which is on the next generation technology and the market projections that we were able to identify.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. Great. So in chapter 2 of this report, as Mike said, we cover state of the technology and the market for next-gen geothermal, how it changes the landscape compared to conventional geothermal. And in particular, I think we do quite a bit of a deep dive into, one, how new technologies transfer risk and change the shape of project development and project risk. Also, we do a lot of work on the sort of changes to the costs for next-gen geothermal, both for EGS as well as for closed loop. And we also sort of make some observations and comments about the industry's progress towards the Earthshot target, $45 a megawatt hour at national average by 2035. And we also talk about some of the recent momentum in the industry overall. So Mike, if you could go to the next slide. I think this group probably knows well, one of the main drivers of costs for geothermal projects is, of course, the drilling rate, right? The rates at which drills can penetrate the subsurface. So on the left, we have data from the DOE Forge demonstration site, which is a research and demonstration site that DOE runs for next generation geothermal technologies. And there we've seen really rapid decreases in drilling times and drilling costs because of operational drilling improvements. So since the first well was drilled in 2017, Forge has demonstrated a 500% increase in drilling rates. So that's really starting to approach standard oil and gas rates shown in red in both the left and the right. And what's I think further evidence of the industry's health overall in this front is that the private sector has shown that these drilling rate improvements can translate to massive cost reductions. So there are recent reports from a geothermal startup called Fervo, where their earliest deployments demonstrated a 300% increase in drilling rates in the process, resulting in drilling costs that decreased from an initial close to $10 million per well to less than $5 million per well in just 6 months. So, Mike, if you could skip to the next slide. I think the implications of changes to drilling costs can really be seen in recent cost reductions and projections. So the report goes into detail, and the Liftoff report, I should say, goes into a lot of detail on cost projections. And it's based a lot on the Earthshot analysis that was produced a few years before the Liftoff report came out. So the way the Earthshot analysis was done for EGS was a base year was modeled based on using a model called GETM, which is a sort of physically based model for geothermal developments that can output levelized costs of energy and overnight capital costs, which are these important cost metrics for energy project development. Overnight capital cost is the full amount of capital you would need upfront to build a project without any sort of discounting. That's why it's overnight, as if you were doing it tonight and tomorrow you had the project. Levelized cost of energy looks at a project's timeline and estimates the sort of average cost using discounted cash flows. And GETM does both of these. And there's a base year, which is 2021, and then there's a target year, which is 2035. And the inputs are really what determine those costs. And then between those years, there is a sort of learning rate curve is applied that is kind of an exponential approach to the target year. And you can read about this on the ATB website. It's the same methodology used there. It's described in our report as well. And happy to discuss in Q&A later as well. But the 2035 target for EGS using all these inputs is roughly $45 a megawatt hour national average, which corresponds to about $3,700 of overnight capital cost. That's shown in the figure on the top left here. On the bottom right, we're looking at a model not of EGS, enhanced geothermal systems, but of closed loop systems. And using the same input, what are the potential costs of a specific configuration for a closed loop system? And this is something new in this report that we report out. And using the Earthshot assumptions, we find that a very simple U-loop design for closed loop systems, so no parallel loops, just a single closed loop, can reach a levelized cost of energy of roughly $80 to $90 by 2035 using if the same technical inputs as the Earthshot are achieved by then, and that's the equivalent of about $9,000 to $10,000 per kilowatt in overnight capital cost. I think one of the most important sort of findings from this report is that since the Earthshot base year was calculated in 2021, we already have information about some of the key inputs into the modeling that show that, in particular, drilling costs and flow rates are already at Forge and in the private sector more than halfway to the 2035 target. And now, when cost reductions happen, they are weighted up front, so the fastest reductions happen earlier. This is still well ahead of the projections that we were counting on even 2 years ago. This is why I think this report states that the industry is on track to hitting the Earthshot target and may, in fact, exceed it. And interestingly, it actually doesn't need to hit the Earthshot target in order to reach liftoff. And so I'll discuss that further in a moment. But in short, I think that these cost figures will be of interest to a lot of folks on this call, and we're happy to discuss them more later. Great, Mike, let's skip to the next slide. Good. So I think capitalizing on these sort of recent technological improvements and demonstrations and these cost reductions, the next generation geothermal market has shown really notable momentum in the last 4 years. So it's over $700 million in total investments in next generation geothermal startups. This is trending up. This is non-governmental support. And these companies and startups have hit really several major milestones, many of which we detail in the Liftoff report. And if of interest, it's worth checking out there. So let's move on now to chapter 3 of the report, which is the chapter where we cover the pathway to liftoff for the geothermal industry overall. So here are 5 key takeaways, which are shown on this slide. I think, the one point I'll say here before I think the rest of these are covered in the rest of this section is the first bullet up top, which is worth noting when thinking about how the geothermal industry differs from other emerging clean technology industries, is that this industry is characterized by a sort of unique combination of factors. So one, we have unusually high upfront costs compared to a lot of other energy technologies. Plus, for the industry overall, we have a maturation timeline wherein not only key risks will be reduced as the technology is proved out, but also the resource base will increase mainly as new projects are developed. And this is different, I think, from any other field, and it makes the trajectory for geothermal unique and special, and also, I think, very promising. So let's go to the next slide here. As discussed, liftoff is a concept that we organize all of these liftoff reports around. And it's the point, sometimes people call it bankability, sometimes people call it self-sustaining development. It's a point at which an industry can continue to grow without sort of concessional capital or support, and start to get financing from lower interest rate finance institutions like banks and infrastructure funds to sort of develop projects and grow more organically. For us, we lay out sort of 3 major conditions at which we see liftoff being reached, and then we discuss some key enablers that we think are necessary to hit those conditions. And so the primary condition is on the left here, which is that to build trust in the private sector, the next generation geothermal industry really needs to create what we call a validation suite of deployments. And so these are deployments with new technologies in 5 to 10 varied and unique geologic conditions or greenfield sites that prove the technology risk is low enough that projects can start to bring in debt during subsurface construction. When we do our capacity expansion modeling of the power sector, we found that using the cost trajectory that I was just describing earlier, these 5 to 10 geologic conditions are achieved after about 2 to 5 gigawatts of total deployment and $20 to $25 billion of investment. And so that's the equivalent of somewhere around 1,500 to 3,000 wells. And that this happens around 2030, which is a 60% cost reduction from the 2023 cost estimate that we showed. So that cost estimate is really one of the key enablers. We see this happening where costs are reduced to $60 to $70 per megawatt hour national average LCOE. Again, I keep saying national average, and that's because in competitive regions, the LCOE can actually be lower. And when we look at the deployments in our modeling, that's closer to $40 to $50 in those competitive early deployment regions. Costs will also be reduced sort of iteratively, as well as impacted by direct research and development that's publicly funded, which will help drive competitiveness in these early key regions. Also on this path, I think the other 3 enablers are equally important. Large-scale demonstrations that help that actually break new ground in greenfield acreage, high-value PPAs that are offtake that properly values the clean firm value proposition, and then very importantly, site selection and development that's in partnership with communities. We call this community-informed siting. the technology needs to develop in concert and in collaboration with the communities that it is sited near. And we see this as a really important part of the overall trajectory. So Mike, if we skip to the next page, this is the page that shows the sort of full pathway to liftoff and scale for the next-gen geothermal industry. We see two stages happening. So the first is this liftoff stage, which I just described. And this is where you really prove the market opportunity. After hitting liftoff in the 2030 timeframe, we need to stay on track to 2030 in order to achieve full scale. And in the achieving scale phase, we see a sort of new ecosystem of developers, investors, utilities, other off-takers forming to develop projects, but also rapidly increase the inventory of economic resources. So the sort of snowballing resource inventory as new acreage is developed. And in this phase, also cost continues to decrease with iterative improvements as well as new RD&D, and eventually a sort of industrializable, repeatable process should develop that can continue to sort of independently develop geothermal projects and leverage the existing oil and gas workforce and supply chain. Finally, let's skip to the last slide in this section. And this slide is sort of the final section of chapter 3, explores the emerging development models that are available to next generation geothermal as the industry matures. So as I mentioned in the beginning, this industry has a unique combination of upfront costs and risks and resource base. I think the TLDR here is that from first of a kind projects, FOAK on the left, to nth of a kind projects, NOAK on the right, there we have a view that's informed by the interviews we did for this report that next generation geothermal can expect sort of the entry of new developer classes, new sources of investment, new development models that drive deployment, and ultimately a fully mature and de-risked geothermal industry could develop projects using a traditional project finance model. So this is a model in which combinations of debt and equity are available early on during a project's life cycle, and the debt is low cost debt that can free up capital for other developments, which is the practice for current traditional renewables developers as well. I think on the path to that model, there's also higher risk financing strategies. And so that would be the middle column here, that could be used and may be in use at the time the industry lifts off. So you see, as the technology is still being proven out, as the resource base is still growing, you may have developer classes who are more comfortable with subsurface risk, subsurface development, who are able to develop projects earlier on using maybe corporate equity, other higher cost finance, high cost debt, maybe in partnership with strategic investor off-takers like your tech off-takers or industrial off-takers who need 24/7 clean, firm power. They may invest in sort of surface construction and early subsurface development, prove down a project's viability, and then sell a project that is sort of been de-risked to recoup investment. This is done in other energy development industries as well. Sometimes people call it the farm down model, and we think this may be sort of a bridge structure for project development of next generation geothermal. So all very interesting project finance, energy finance questions. Happy to discuss further in the Q&A session if there's any interest. But with that, let me kick it back to Mike, who can dive into chapter 4, which is the challenges and opportunities of this space.
Thank you, Charles. Appreciate it. And yeah, we took all of that information that was sort of brought to us through these interviews and tried to structure them in sort of 5 key buckets of challenges that people kept bringing up that are hampering commercialization in this industry. The largest one being upfront costs and risk at the early stage, constraining the development capital and limiting geographic reach. The second one being perceived and actual operability risk for deployments in this new technology space, proving that the thing works the way we said it was going to. Third is long and unpredictable development life cycles driven by permitting and interconnection, and we've already seen some improvement in the permitting space since this report has gone out, and we anticipate that we think there's more that can be done. Fourth, existing business models that undervalue the potential for next generation geothermal. And then five, the making sure that we do that thoughtful community engagement so that community opposition isn't triggered to be potentially destructive to projects. So I'm going to go into a little bit more depth on each of these, and then we will have some time for questions. So the report identifies the primary barrier really being high costs and high risks at the start of new projects, limiting available capital, slowing the pipeline of new demonstrations, and reducing the opportunities for cost reduction. There were only 25 geothermal wells drilled in the US in 2022 compared to over 24,000 wells per year drilled by the oil and gas industry when unconventional oil and gas extraction was being first demonstrated. These few new wells occurred the few geothermal wells that we did get mostly occurred in already de-risked environments. However, the validation of next generation geothermal technologies requires expanding into new acreages. So the fastest path to enable next generation geothermal scale up is through early capital to finance new demonstration projects in these new regions. We talked to a number of investors who talked about sort of needing somewhere between 5 to 10 demonstrations in 10 demonstrations and 5 to 10 unique geologies. It's a validation suite that would cost about $4.5 billion to get started for the liftoff phase to finance validation of first of a kind demonstrations in varied geologies sourced from governments, equity investors, corporate venture, or strategic investor off-takers, or oil and gas, all players that could be involved. Demand side signals can also have a major impact. I talked about this California public utility rule, and the best example of demand side that we've seen so far to spur geothermal development. The California Public Utilities Commission mandated the procurement of about a gigawatt of clean firm power by 2026, which has driven the signing of over 400 megawatts of new conventional and next generation geothermal power purchases at and exceeding $70 a megawatt hour. Finally, high value power purchase agreements for large, well-capitalized private providers, such as data centers or manufacturers, might also be of interest. Last month, Google and Amazon partnered with the steel giant Nucor to issue a request for proposals for new clean firm power sources, building off an already successful partnership between Google and Fervo that started in 2021. Targeted new financial instruments can also provide early funds for development, such as cost-shared drilling programs, or can also continual R&D that reduces the number of wells that you need to prove out a resource, or improves the precision of measurements that are collected during drilling, decreases the amount of time and materials needed for each well. All of these can help reduce that early upfront cost for geothermal. The next is perceived and actual operability risk for deployments. We heard over and over again that there is an elevated site-specific resource characterization risk that's associated with subsurface projects and geothermal in particular that other clean energy investors, other clean energy technologies don't necessarily have. Investors are a little spooked by the subsurface and want to see evidence that these next generation geothermal technologies have truly eliminated the resource risk that frightens them. Developers must demonstrate that next generation geothermal projects can be truly developed in new environments without prior geothermal activity. This is why it's so critical that a validation suite of geothermal technologies has some intentional location diversity to it. 10 different unique geologies or geographic provinces where different entities can become comfortable with this technology. Also seeing how the technology operates when it fails, seeing how it can be how you can rescue the technology from a failure is something of great interest to investors. We talked about the long and unpredictable development lifecycle driven by permitting. Development uncertainty here stems from a complex and interconnected permitting and licensing process that I'm sure everyone on the phone here is familiar with. This is particularly for projects in federally managed land where most geothermal projects today occur. Changes driven by technology and policy could increase the certainty and cut project timelines by up to 3 years. Policy changes could allow the combination of certain categorical exclusions, one of which we've already seen occur, and centralize key subject matter experts in one location. Changes enabled by the technology include the ability to flexibly site the power plant, such that they can be included earlier in permitting plans. Both the current steps in the process, which are symbolized by the upper row of this figure, as well as a potential future reformed process below, are described in detail in the report and chapter 4. And we're happy to answer questions on that as well. The business model case for geothermal is an area where we heard there are struggles, right? The value of clean firm power is not always recognized in PPAs. Business models that properly value next generation geothermal can also spur development. Utilities consider clean electricity sources and firm electricity sources as separate products with separate markets. However, to decarbonize the grid, firm power must also be clean, and the cost of that joint value proposition is higher. Although these clean firm sources are in high demand by mid-century, they have high costs today that prevent them from being deployed, and few public markets are looking to join this joint value proposition. Public utility commissions can reproduce the successful model demonstrated in California to mandate the procurement of clean, firm power to enhance grid reliability. This solution, although likely premature in the eastern US, where resources are still unproven, could spur substantial quick development in the West, more than has already been seen. Project design can also drive more revenue, right? So flexible operation, we've already shown, can increase value. Also, targeted strategic off-takers, such as pairing zero carbon industrial processes, direct air capture, or hydrogen production with geothermal, can be profitable. The world's first DAC facility is powered by geothermal energy, and studies are investigating expanded feasibility of these opportunities. Finally, this community opposition piece is a very serious concern. So technical similarities between EGS and oil and gas hydraulic fracturing could prompt environmental health concerns like those pertaining to hydraulic fracturing. While key differences in the environments and the designs of these unconventional wells and next generation geothermal wells reduce many of the environmental risks associated with drilling and hydraulic fracturing, lack of public awareness of these differences could create opposition. Next generation geothermal developers can benefit from a transparent and robust environmental monitoring to ensure that environmental impacts are minimized and the technology develops a strong social license to operate. The department has a 10-year plus history of successfully managing seismic activity at its EGS sites through its protocols, which other projects should adopt. Similarly, transparent monitoring and disclosure of any chemicals leveraged in the next generation geothermal developments can improve operator licensing, including the option to use non-toxic chemicals when you have the choice to do so. Geothermal operators can proactively mitigate these concerns through local trust building, engagement, and community-informed siting. And what we mean by community-informed siting is that the community has the opportunity to either change or reject a proposal. Operators can take additional steps to ensure local communities understand and accept the project and their impacts. For example, at DOE's Utah Forge site, there are seismicity monitors in the public library to just transparently display how drilling is impacting seismicity in real time. That is the high-level overview of this report. I know we said it's a drill down, and it was an hour, but we do have more. That's in the report that we encourage you to go to, liftoff.energy.gov, as well. If you'd like to provide input for the next round of the reports, liftoff.energy.gov/input. And with that, we really appreciate your time. And Brian, I'll kick it over to you for questions if there are any.
Yes, great. Thanks, Michael and Charles. We do have some questions actually. So let's see. First question up is, let's start with this one. Okay, so we have heard some people believe that the Liftoff report is an overly optimistic perspective of the geothermal industry. In the United States, the United States does lead in the geothermal industry with the most electrons on the grid. So a lot of other countries look to the US for guidance and direction. What gives you the confidence in these models that you've developed in the Liftoff report that this is not an overly optimistic perspective and analysis?
That's a great question. Charles, you want
It
to go
is.
for it?
It is a great question. I'm happy to jump in, and I'm going to try doing camera on here and see how this works. But tell me if I start to cut out. So I think Mike went to the right slide here. The reason why I'm we're confident we're on the cost trajectories that we're on are that we're already, as I mentioned, beating some of the technical inputs into those very ambitious 2035 targets. And that's because of the drilling improvements that we see at Forge. That's because of things like flow rate, things like the potential size of the power plant that can get the cost down to that $45 a megawatt hour national average. And again, national average, like in competitive regions where the resource is closer to the surface, in that first resource slide that Mike showed, those costs are even lower. And so when we do this very objective least cost modeling, which takes into account only the costs of geothermal developments, as well as the cost of other technologies, we're seeing this deployment on the scale of 100 gigawatts by 2050. And there's not much change in the price after 2035. That's not to say there's no work to be done, right? This is why we set a path to liftoff. We set the enablers. We talk about the challenges. But in a world where the only, or not the only, but one of the main things we need to do is achieve technical milestones that we're already ahead of, I think the optimism is warranted, and the validation that we're seeing in both scientific research as well as private sector deployment help give us the confidence that this is not a rose-tinted picture of the industry's future.
Cool. Okay. So one other question here that we have is, you talked about the validation suite of deployments, and that 5 to 10 is where investors would start feeling more comfortable about geothermal technologies. Where are we today in regards to this target? From your perspective, do we have any of those 5 to 10 yet? And maybe which ones are they, if you wouldn't mind sharing that?
I think it's fair to say we've got one. And that's what's going on in Milford. We've seen what's a number of developments, right? DOE has done a fair number of simulation, and now Fervo's coming in and doing more. There's work on a second site that Fervo's working on, but I think that the basin and range might be a hot spot for activity. It's important that we don't all go to the same spot in the basin and range to unlock the next generation potential. There's awards from the Geothermal Technologies Office for new EGS demos, one of which is going to be sort of in the Northern California area near the geysers. It would be phenomenal in addition to the power system, but it's not necessarily a new location, right? It's the geysers. So I think we're talking about this is a little bit of a paradigm shift in this industry, where you're not going to go to somewhere where you already have, where you can minimize the risks of new development. You actually are going to take some development risk because you need to go and demonstrate the plug and play modularity of this technology. And that is part of why economics alone might not unlock that problem. There need to be some other incentives.
Yeah, and I would be remiss if I didn't sort of mention that Congress has actually authorized 4 Forge projects, funded only one of them in Utah, but there is the existing authorizations there. We just need Congress to appropriate the necessary funding. And if I understand it correctly as well, Jason Sorter, our policy director, would make sure I wanted to point this out, that some of those Forge projects could be east of the Mississippi. Maybe one of them has to be, I think, statutorily.
One of them does have to be. Yep.
So it's a question then that I maybe is a little too high level for you two, but with this liftoff report that has it mentions over the DOE is identified as much as $5 billion needed a year in funding over 5 years to commercialize geothermal. How does that align with DOE's current budget requests and Congress's current appropriations?
Yeah, so I mean, it's the right question, Brian. I think the one important point to stress there is that the 5 billion a year is an investment, not just public funding or private funding. Like it is investment in projects, and these should be profitable projects, right? So like first of a kind deployments often still make money. And so I think the slide that Mike, if you could go to the developer class slide, um, we see, you know, the leftmost column here being the most likely way that the capital for those early deployments assemble up to 20, at least, you know, the next 5-ish years. So you know, this is corporate equity, early stage. This is possibly some combination of philanthropy and public grants, as well as strategic investor off-takers, people who have the need for the power that these projects would produce. And you know, you're not the equity is unlevered. The returns will be a little bit different before you move to the middlemost column here, right, where you can start to pull in other types of debt and other types of equity. So it's not just $5 billion of public funding. But I do think that, you know, where public funding can help is as a part of the capital stack in the investment that goes into these early projects. And I think, you know, there's where the industry can articulate how sort of viable these projects are based on the public contribution will help the whole, like, you know, ecosystem overall understand where support is needed from philanthropy and public grants.
Yeah, and I also want to highlight that, like, yes, it is true that a lot of investment is needed, and it is true that we are writing a really optimistic liftoff report about a technology that has been underinvested in. And
Yeah.
so that number doesn't necessarily that is not a win or go home kind of number. There is there are lots of strategic locations where public capital would be very, very important, such as that early de-risking, right? That we described, that you really have trouble seeing anybody else taking that kind of risk on. That's where the government is there for to do. But as a project becomes more likely to make money, we don't anticipate that requiring $5 billion of capital to be lost due to risk.
Okay, so we're running out of time, but I do want to I have one more question. Donovan Gordon, I see is plugged in and asks a question from New York State, and I want to link it to another question here that came in, and that is, do you two, or does the Department of Energy see a model in the US where there is a state that's maybe leading in geothermal that can be replicated? Maybe this is Texas, California, Colorado, the thermal energy network legislation that's being passed in New York State. So sort of bringing in Donovan's question here as well. How might other states that currently don't have a framework for heating and cooling or for power production explore whether it's enhanced geothermal in New York or closed loop in New York, or thermal energy networks and closed loop, direct use systems in Louisiana? What models are there out there that you're seeing?
I think that's a good question. I do just want to be very precise about what we're talking about here, the type of geothermal. The challenges we see here are the challenges that we saw for getting power production online. We're currently working on efforts for assessing the heating and cooling space, but our initial understanding of it is that there are awfully different challenges that industry faces that I think are significant and serious and do need to be addressed. But the reason I bring it up is because the leadership for some of those technologies is occurring in some states where it is not leading in the other technology, right? You are seeing a lot of interest in leadership in places like New York and Minnesota for heating and cooling, but that's not where I would direct anybody to go if they wanted to understand a successful model for geothermal power. I think the geothermal power model that is most successful right now is a combination of California's state mandates with Nevada's capability for transmission. Is sort of what we're seeing, and that's not that's not a single state program, but it is a model that's showing that public policy can drive demand, and then that demand can drive investment. And I think that's basically the formula we need to be seeing everywhere. If you want to do that in New York, that's totally viable. New York has mandates on the books that would drive for clean, firm power, and it's just now a matter of making the utility incentive substantial enough for exploration to be valuable. It's not unlike the model that we see for, unconventional oil and gas was technically viable in the 1970s, but the first barrels didn't come to the market until conventional oil prices kind of skyrocketed in the early aughts. And so we're kind of that's the model I see is policy can drive the economic conditions necessary for exploration, and California has shown that.
Yeah, do either of you know, is there a well stimulation limitations in New York State? I don't know off the top of my head.
I know
But-
that they have an anti-fracking ban, but I don't know if the anti-fracking ban extends to geothermal.
Okay, that was what I was curious about. As it relates to enhanced geothermal, I know in California and Colorado, those anti-fracking bans that are either being discussed or are being passed specifically exclude geothermal. If that is happening in New York, Donovan, one to your specific question of enhanced geothermal in New York State, that'd be something to look into. Okay, we have one more question and then we'll wrap it up. So speaking of PPAs and transmission, how can we ensure geothermal projects are given the priority in transmission and interconnection queues as that 100% stable, reliable baseload power?
I think the California example is really the best example in terms of spurring development and also prioritizing transmission. I wouldn't actually want to comment on transmission queues and interconnection queues and prioritization there. But Mike, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I think that's a grid systems question that this report doesn't go into as deeply as the next iteration could.
Awesome. And there was one other question about induced seismicity protocols. Very important question.
Yes, they are being updated. And yes, they're being updated to include AIML and, make sure that we're using the best available data. So I absolutely there's a need for them to reflect our capabilities, and that's happening.
Great. Well, Michael and Charles, thank you so much for joining us today. We really enjoyed the conversation. It was enlightening and impactful. The report you've written is well done, and I know that speaking from the geothermal community, we really appreciate the time and effort you all put into that. I know it was a very long process, and we appreciate everything you've done, and we look forward to the heating and cooling report that you're working on as well, the next Liftoff report for another segment of the geothermal industry. So with that, I just want to remind everybody that Geothermal Rising does have a lot of events in the pipeline. A critical minerals event in later this year, our Washington, D.C. Hill Day in June, a subsurface and AI symposium in the last week of July and the 1st of August. And then we have our annual Geothermal Rising Conference in Hawaii, along with the Indigenous Geothermal Symposium, both the last week, full week of October on the Big Island in Hawaii. Registration is open for those events, so please go to the geothermal.org website and you can start registering to attend any and all of those events. So Michael and Charles, thank you so much. And we look forward to carrying on this conversation in other venues.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Talk soon. Bye-bye.